What if I told you that one of the most hated villains in Game of Thrones history was already walking around Westeros almost a century before the Red Wedding ever happened? That's right, we're talking about Walder Frey, the Lord of the Crossing himself, and his surprising appearance as a snot-nosed toddler in George R.R. Martin's Tales of Dunk and Egg. This is a story about how one of fantasy's most infamous characters made his debut not as a cunning old schemer, but as an annoying 4-year-old child at a wedding, and why this cameo is one of the most brilliant pieces of foreshadowing in the entire Westeros saga. Before we dive into young Walder's appearance, we need to understand the world he appeared in. The Tales of Dunk and Egg is a series of novellas written by George R.R. Martin that take place roughly 90 years before the events of A Game of Thrones. These stories follow the adventures of Sir Duncan the Tall, a simple hedge knight with a good heart, and his mysterious young squire who goes by the nickname Egg. What makes these stories special is that they give us a ground-level view of Westeros during the reign of the Targaryen dynasty, long before Robert's rebellion, long before the Mad King, and definitely long before anyone had heard of the War of the Five Kings. The beauty of these novellas is that they're much smaller in scope compared to the main series. We're not dealing with massive battles or complex political intrigue spanning entire continents. Instead, we're following a wandering knight and his squire as they travel from place to place, getting involved in local disputes, tournaments, and occasionally stumbling into much bigger conspiracies than they bargained for. It's almost like a medieval buddy cop story, except one of the buddies happens to be secretly a Targaryen prince, but we'll get to that later. Now, the specific story where young Walder Frey makes his appearance is called The Mystery Knight, which is the third novella in the Dunk and Egg series. This story was published in 2010 as part of an anthology called Warriors, and it takes place in the year 212 after Conquest, which puts it approximately 86 years before the events of A Game of Thrones begin. Think about that for a moment. This means that when we meet Walder Frey as a 4-year-old child in The Mystery Knight, he still has 86 more years of scheming, plotting, and generally being unlikable ahead of him before he orchestrates the single most shocking event in Game of Thrones history. The Mystery Knight begins with Duncan and Egg traveling through the Riverlands on their way north. They're heading to take up service with Lord Baron Stark, who has called for men to help defend against Greyjoy raids on the northern coast. But as is often the case in these stories, they get sidetracked. Along the road, they encounter a group of nobles traveling to a wedding, and among them is a charismatic man calling himself Sir John the Fiddler. Despite some tensions with other members of the group, John the Fiddler invites Duncan to attend the wedding of Lord Ambrose Butterwell to a daughter of House Frey at a place called White Walls. Now here's where things get interesting. Duncan decides to go to this wedding because there's supposed to be a grand tournament with a dragon egg as the prize. For a poor hedge knight like Duncan, the chance to win some gold and maybe even glory at a tourney is too good to pass up. What he doesn't realize is that he's walking straight into the middle of a conspiracy involving Blackfire pretenders, treasonous lords, and one of the most powerful men in the Seven Kingdoms. But we're not here to talk about the broader conspiracy, we're here to talk about a certain snot-nosed 4-year-old. The actual description of young Walder Frey in the novella is brilliantly subtle. George R.R. Martin doesn't make a big deal out of it, doesn't put neon signs pointing at this character saying, "Hey, remember this kid? He's going to be super important later." Instead, he gives us this brief description. Lord Frey of the Crossing was a lean man, elegant in blue and gray, his heir a chinless boy of 4 whose nose was dripping snot. That's it. That's the entire description. A chinless boy of 4 whose nose was dripping snot. What's fascinating about this description is that it wasn't even confirmed to be Walder Frey initially. Martin never actually names the child in the text of The Mystery Knight. Readers had to do the math themselves, figuring out that if Walder Frey was turning 90 years old during the events of A Game of Thrones in 298 AC, that means he was born in 208 AC, which would make him exactly 4 years old in 212 AC when The Mystery Knight takes place. It wasn't until later that George R.R. Martin himself confirmed on his blog that, yes, this snot-nosed, chinless 4-year-old was indeed the future architect of the Red Wedding. Think about the genius of this for a moment. Martin planted this Easter egg for dedicated readers who were paying attention to the timeline and doing the calculations. It's the kind of detail that rewards fans who are really invested in the world and its history. And once you know that this is Walder Frey, suddenly that brief description takes on so much more meaning. The chinless aspect, for instance, becomes particularly amusing when you remember that in Game of Thrones, Walder Frey is described as having a weak chin and generally being physically unimpressive despite his power and wealth. Martin is telling us that Walder was chinless even as a child. The setting of young Walder's appearance is also incredibly ironic. He appears at a wedding. Not just any wedding, but a wedding between House Frey and House Butterwell. The boy who would grow up to host the most infamous wedding in Westerosi history, a wedding where sacred guest right was violated and hundreds of people were massacred, first appears in Martin's works at a wedding celebration. You can't make this stuff up. Well, actually, George R.R. Martin did make it up, but you know what I mean. The foreshadowing is absolutely delicious. What's even better is Duncan's reaction to the child. In the story, Duncan finds young Walder annoying. The kid is described as having a high-pitched laugh, and Duncan apparently considers throwing him down a well at one point. This has been interpreted by many readers as Martin giving fans a bit of service, allowing Duncan to express what everyone who watched Game of Thrones felt about old Walder Frey. It's as if Martin is saying through Duncan, yeah, I know you all hate this guy, and guess what? He was annoying even as a toddler. Now, let's talk about why this cameo appearance matters beyond just being a cool Easter egg. First of all, it demonstrates something important about George R.R. Martin's approach to world building. He's not just creating a story for one series of books. He's building an entire world with a functioning history where characters can appear at different points in the timeline. Walder Frey living to be over 90 years old means he spans nearly a century of Westerosi history. He was alive during the Blackfyre rebellions. He lived through multiple kings. He saw the Targaryen dynasty fall and Robert Baratheon rise. This is a man who has weathered every storm by being opportunistic, cowardly, and always looking out for himself first. The fact that we see him as a child in the Dunk and Egg stories adds depth to his character in the main series. When we meet him in a Game of Thrones as this ancient, cantankerous old man who can field an army from his breeches, as the saying goes, we're meeting someone who has been playing the Game of Thrones for longer than most of the other players have been alive. He's outlived rivals, outlived enemies, outlived friends if he ever had any, all by being exactly what he is. A survivor with no principles beyond self-preservation. There's also something poetically tragic about his appearance in The Mystery Knight. Young Walder is just a toddler, innocent in the way all 4-year-olds are, even if he is annoying with his snot and his high-pitched laugh. He hasn't done anything wrong yet, he hasn't betrayed anyone, hasn't violated guest right, hasn't orchestrated any massacres. He's just a kid attending his sister's wedding with his father. But we, as readers who know what he becomes, can't look at him without feeling a sense of dread and disgust. It raises interesting questions about fate and character. Was Walder Frey always destined to become the villain he became? Or did the long years and the constant struggle to maintain his family's position twist him into something monstrous? The appearance of young Walder Frey also serves another purpose in the broader Dunk and Egg narrative. It reminds us that these stories, while set in the past, are intrinsically connected to the main series. Characters we know from A Song of Ice and Fire have histories that stretch back into this earlier era. Walder Frey is the most obvious example because he actually appears on the page, but there are others as well. Maester Aemon, who serves at Castle Black in the main series, is Egg's older brother in these stories. Bloodraven, who becomes the three-eyed raven that teaches Bran Stark, is a major player in The Mystery Knight. These connections create a sense of continuity and make the world feel lived in and real. It's worth noting that young Walder's appearance in The Mystery Knight is very brief. He's not a major character in the story. He doesn't have any lines of dialogue. He's basically just there as part of the background, a member of the Frey delegation attending the wedding. But that's part of what makes it so effective. Martin doesn't need to make a big deal out of it because the weight of the reference does all the work. Readers who recognize who this child is will have that moment of realization, that oh no, no moment when they put the pieces together. The wedding at White Walls, where young Walder appears, ends up being the site of a thwarted conspiracy. Without spoiling too much of The Mystery Knight for those who haven't read it, the tournament and wedding are covers for a gathering of Blackfyre supporters planning another rebellion. The whole thing gets shut down by Bloodraven, who arrives with an army and essentially arrests everyone involved. The castle of White Walls is torn down, which is why it doesn't appear in the main series. Lord Butterwell loses most of his wealth and status. Many of the conspirators are executed or sent to the wall. It's a complete disaster for everyone involved. But the Freys, House Frey manages to come out of it relatively unscathed because they weren't actually part of the conspiracy. They were just there for the wedding, which was legitimate even if it became a cover for treason. This is very much in keeping with the Frey family strategy that we see in the main series. They have a talent for being adjacent to major events without fully committing until they know which side is going to win. Lord Walder Frey, even as the father of a 4-year-old in The Mystery Knight, was already playing that game, showing up for a wedding but not getting involved in the treasonous plotting happening around it. Now, let's talk about something really exciting for fans. HBO is adapting the Dunk and Egg stories into a television series called A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, which is set to premiere in early 2026. The show will follow Duncan and Egg through their adventures in Westeros, starting with the first novella, The Hedge Knight. If the show is successful and gets renewed for multiple seasons, it will eventually adapt The Mystery Knight, which means we could actually see young Walder Frey on screen. The showrunner of A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, Ira Parker, has already talked about his ideas for including young Walder in the series. In an interview, Parker revealed that he has what he calls a hopefully really funny idea for Walder's appearance. He envisions a scene where there's some kind of accident, like a runaway horse cart, and the toddler Walder is about to be killed when Duncan intervenes and saves his life. Parker says he wants to play it straight without making a big deal out of it. Just let it happen and move on with the story. The idea that Duncan the Tall, a genuinely heroic and good-hearted character, would unknowingly save the life of someone who would become one of Westeros' greatest villains is darkly ironic and perfectly in keeping with George R.R. Martin's style. This potential scene adds another layer to the tragedy of Walder Frey's story. Imagine Duncan saving a child's life because that's what a true knight does, never knowing that this child will grow up to orchestrate one of the most heinous violations of sacred law in Westerosi history. It's the kind of cruel irony that Martin loves. It also means that in a weird way, Duncan the Tall would be partially responsible for the Red Wedding happening, because without him, Walder might have died as a child. Of course, Duncan has no way of knowing this, and you can't blame someone for saving a child's life. But the bitter irony would not be lost on fans. The inclusion of young Walder Frey in A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, if it happens, would also serve as a bridge between the different Game of Thrones shows. House of the Dragon takes place about 170 years before Game of Thrones. A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms takes place about 90 years before Game of Thrones. And of course, Game of Thrones itself is the main timeline. By having characters like Walder Frey who span multiple eras, the shows can create connections that make the entire franchise feel more cohesive. Viewers watching A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms will see this little kid and know what he becomes, creating a sense of dramatic irony that enhances the viewing experience. It's also worth considering what young Walder's appearance tells us about House Frey's position in Westeros during this era. The Freys are already an established and respected house at this point. Lord Frey is described as lean and elegant, dressed in fine clothes of blue and gray. They're important enough to be arranging marriages with other noble houses. The twins, their castle that controls the crossing of the Green Fork, is already a source of their power and wealth. This isn't a house on the rise, it's a house that has already risen and established itself. What this means is that by the time of Game of Thrones, House Frey has been wealthy and influential for at least a century, which makes their perpetual chip on their shoulder about not being respected even more interesting. The Freys in the main series are constantly complaining about being looked down upon by older, more prestigious houses. Walder Frey himself is bitter about perceived slights and the lack of respect he receives from houses like the Tullys, despite House Frey being sworn to them. But as we see in The Mystery Knight, House Frey was already a significant power nearly 90 years earlier. They weren't upstarts or new money. They had been around for a long time. This suggests that their resentment isn't really about being new or lacking prestige. It's about something deeper, perhaps about the way the Freys have always been seen as toll collectors and profiteers rather than true nobility. They're rich because they control the bridge, not because of ancient bloodlines or great deeds in battle. Young Walder, growing up in this environment, in a house that's wealthy and powerful but constantly feeling disrespected, probably shaped who he became. By the time we meet him in Game of Thrones, he spent 9 decades nursing grievances and plotting how to elevate his family's status. The Red Wedding, horrible as it was, can be seen as the culmination of almost a century of Frey ambition and resentment. It was Walder's way of finally making House Frey feared if they couldn't be respected. And it worked, in a sense. After the Red Wedding, everyone in Westeros knew who House Frey was and what they were capable of, even if it also made them the most hated house in the Seven Kingdoms. There's also something to be said about the longevity of Walder Frey as a character. In a world where most people don't live past 60 or 70, Walder makes it past 90. He's almost supernaturally old by Westerosi standards. This raises the question of how he managed to live so long. He's not particularly healthy or vigorous. In his old age, he's described as being ancient and decrepit. But he endures. Some fans have joked that he's too mean to die, that his spite and bitterness keep him alive long past his natural expiration date. There might be some truth to that, at least metaphorically. Walder has always been a survivor, someone who adapts and compromises and does whatever it takes to keep himself and his house alive. That survival instinct has served him well for nearly a century. The contrast between young Walder at the wedding in the Mystery Night and old Walder at the Red Wedding in A Storm of Swords is striking. At the White Walls wedding, he's just a child, a passive observer with no agency or power. At the Red Wedding, he's the host, the orchestrator, the man with all the power who makes the decisions that result in the deaths of Robb Stark, Catelyn Stark, and hundreds of Stark soldiers. The journey from that snot-nosed toddler to the Lord of the Crossing who violates guest right is a long one, spanning nearly 9 decades of Westerosi history. What happened in those years to turn that child into that monster? We may never know all the details, but the fact that we see both ends of his life gives us a fuller picture of his character arc. George R.R. Martin has always been fascinated by the long view of history. He's interested in how events ripple out across decades and generations, how decisions made in one era have consequences in another. The appearance of young Walder Frey in The Mystery Night is a perfect example of this. It's a reminder that history is continuous, that the players in the Game of Thrones are constantly changing, but the game itself endures. Walder Frey, who witnesses history unfold across nearly a century, is in many ways the embodiment of that continuity. He's a bridge between the age of Dunk and Egg and the age of Jon Snow and Daenerys Targaryen. It's also interesting to note that Walder Frey and Brynden Rivers, also known as Bloodraven or the Three-Eyed Raven, are the only 2 characters who appear in both the Dunk and Egg stories and the main A Song of Ice and Fire series. Both are incredibly long-lived, though for different reasons. Bloodraven's longevity is mystical, tied to his connection with the weirwood trees and his transformation into the Three-Eyed Raven. Walder's is purely natural, or at least we assume it is. He's just a man who happens to live a really, really long time. The fact that these 2 characters, one good and one evil, one mystical and one mundane, both span the same historical period creates an interesting parallel between them. What makes young Walder's appearance in The Mystery Night so memorable is that it works on multiple levels. For readers who don't know who he is, he's just a minor background detail, a toddler at a wedding. For readers who do know, it's an Easter egg that rewards their knowledge of the series. For future viewers of A Night of the Seven Kingdoms, assuming the show makes it to a 3rd season and includes this scene, it will be a moment of recognition and dread. Oh no, they're about to say baby Hitler, essentially. It's the kind of multi-layered storytelling that Martin excels at, where something can be simultaneously insignificant and deeply meaningful, depending on your perspective. The Mystery Night and young Walder's appearance also serve as a reminder that the world of Westeros is much bigger and more complex than what we see in the main series. There are centuries of history, thousands of characters, and countless stories that we'll never fully know. Young Walder is just one small thread in that vast tapestry, but he's a thread that connects different eras and different stories. He's proof that the past and the present in Westeros are always intertwined, that decisions and events from one generation echo into the next. In conclusion, the appearance of young Walder Frey, 90 years before Game of Thrones in The Mystery Night, is one of the most brilliantly subtle pieces of storytelling in George R.R. Martin's entire body of work. It's a brief moment, A throwaway description of a snot-nosed 4-year-old at a wedding, but it carries enormous weight for those who know what this child will become. It's an Easter egg for dedicated fans, a piece of foreshadowing that adds depth to Walder's character in the main series, and a connection between different eras of Westerosi history. When A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms eventually brings this moment to television screens, assuming the show gets that far, it will be fascinating to see how they handle it. Will they play it straight as showrunner Ira Parker suggests, just a quick moment of Duncan saving a child without making a big deal out of it? Or will there be a knowing wink to the audience, a subtle hint that this child is special in some terrible way? Either approach could work, but knowing Martin's style, the subtler the better. Because sometimes the most powerful moments in storytelling are the ones that are barely there at all, the quiet details that carry devastating implications for those who know where to look. Young Walder Frey, the chinless boy with the dripping nose, is exactly that kind of moment, and that's what makes it so perfect.